everybody, and welcome to the channel. In today's video, we are continuing our student showcase series, and today's topic is going to be on mundane astrology and the birth of place, presented by Laurie Waters. Again, we would like to thank our community for helping to support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing, and we always love to hear your thoughts and comments below the videos. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you are enjoying our content. As a reminder, coming up on October 1st at 1 p.m. Pacific, we have esteemed astrologer Maurice Fernandez doing a free webinar on the power and magic of eclipses. If you would like to join that free webinar, please see the link below this video in the description and click to register. If you are interested in learning about Kepler's classes, webinars, and workshops, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get to the video.
I'm Laurie Waters, and I've been a student here at Kepler College since 2018. And I'm currently on track to finish my professional diploma in astrology next spring in March. So it's been a wonderful journey being here at Kepler, and I cannot recommend it enough. Let's start with a brief overview of what mundane astrology is. It is the astrology of nations and groups and could be considered an astrology of the collective. It looks at how planetary energies are affecting a group or nation as a whole, which will therefore affect all of its citizens or members. As Carl Jung said, the psychology of the individual is reflected in the psychology of the nation. Our first knowledge of astrology being practiced dates back to Mesopotamian times around 1700 BC. This original astrology was indeed mundane astrology. Astrology was used to advise the rulers, gain a tactical advantage in wars, and predict the success of the agricultural year. Astrology was practiced for the betterment of the collective, not really individuals. When we first see natal charts come into being is around 500 BC, and we see them being used in tandem with mundane astrology. For example, astrology would consider the natal chart of a ruler of an area to predict the outcomes for that area. Then, as prominent citizens began to have their natal charts read, the astrology of the country or nation would be considered in that reading for the individual. Strictly natal astrology is a relatively new astrology of the last 900 years or so, really taking off in the 20th century. The main differences the practicing astrologer will notice with mundane astrology is in the keywords and associations for the planets and houses being different than those that we use in natal astrology. The essence remains the same, but we look at them differently. For example, the fourth house that we know natally as the home, our foundation and roots, our parents, in mundane astrology is about the land, the people upon the land, and the crops and produce that come from the land. The 11th house we know as social groups when we're looking at the natal, whereas in mundane astrology, it represents Congress or Parliament, the acting representatives in government. Some examples of the differences with planets would be the sun, which is our essence or vitality when we look at it individually. On the mundane level, it becomes the leader, the president, or the governor of the nation or state. The moon in mundane astrology represents the people of that group or nation. I'll talk about these differences some more as we get into looking at the chart. As all astrology begins with the casting of a chart, in mundane astrology, we must determine the birth chart of a place. Originally, ancient astrologers would cast an Aries ingress chart for the seat of power's location. Over time, astrologers began using a set quote-unquote birth chart for a nation or group similar to how we look at an individual's birth chart. Determining a birth or a founding of a place is certainly a debatable point, which we know we astrologers love to do. We see this with several different US charts that are currently used by astrologers today. One of today's greatest mundane astrologers is Nicholas Campion, and he wrote a book called The Book of World Horoscopes. And in there, he said that the concept of a national birth chart can be misleading. He wrote that he concluded that any state may have a series of national horoscopes resulting from the critical moment in that state's political reorganization. Some horoscopes may be more important than others, but in some cases, a state may have horoscopes which function equally as major national charts. In other words, there may be many charts that work for a nation or state. There are several critical moments that can be considered as a birth chart for a place. These include a constitutional change, a coup, a revolt, a coronation. We may see a new chart for England when King Charles is officially coronated, supposedly next spring, I think. And a declaration or treaty for independence, which is what we base the USA's birth chart on. In my own research for California, I have found 3 differing charts for the start of the state, but the most accurate in my personal work has been the chart for the current constitution that the state is operating under. Let's dive into those charts now. These are the 3 charts that I consider as key points in the founding of California. We have the original Constitution, which was passed November 13th, 1849. Then we have the day California was admitted to the United States on September 9th, 1850. And finally, my preferred chart, which is the current Constitution of California that was enacted on July 4th, 1879. Let's start with the founding of the Republic of California. This came after the Mexican-American War and the California campaign of that war, known as the Conquest of California. How Mars is that name? And you'll see Mars plays a big part in this chart. This Constitution was drafted in October 1849 in Monterey by American pioneers, European settlers, and California natives who were Spanish-speaking. Therefore, the Constitution was originally drafted in both Spanish and English. California, in its initial formation as a republic, was a bilingual republic, and I wonder when we will return to that. This Constitution was passed by the electorate on November 13th, which decreed that the seat of power would be in San Jose, and this is what this chart is based on. This chart clearly shows itself as an attempt to create order after the land grab war. The sun, moon, and ascendant ruler of Mercury are all in Scorpio in the 6th house, looking to Mars in the 2nd house. The 6th house rules service, the workers, the public servant, and the 2nd house in mundane astrology rules resources and security. We see Mars in Cancer in mutual reception to the moon in Scorpio. This Constitution was to bring security to the people after a long military conflict over the resources of California. And notice that Mars is out of bounds. Mars is in overdrive for this initial establishment of California. Mars in mundane astrology is the military and how the military is used. It's the collective need of a society to express itself aggressively. It's a power grab. Notice Jupiter in its detriment in Virgo in the 4th house, which relates to the land. The 11th house in mundane astrology is the legislature or governing body. We see this established with Saturn, which speaks to the legal system, authority, and tradition in Aries in that 11th house, also looking back to Mars in that 2nd house. So we have congressional power over the resources. Also in the 11th house is Pluto and Uranus within 4 degrees of each other, which gives us some foreshadowing that this will not be a lasting constitution for California. There will be a radical restructuring. Notice that Venus is at the midpoint opposition between Pluto and Uranus. Women could not vote and were left out of the political system. In mundane astrology, Venus is also the glue that holds together a society or collective. This will be a government that has the continual pressure on it from the populace to evolve. Finally, notice that the moon is very dark. It's the day before the new moon. This is a closing of a period of war in California history, which creates the establishment of the California Republic. Now let's look at the chart for admission day, when California was accepted as a state. This is the chart that is regularly used for mundane outlooks on California. To me, this chart is more a chart of the federal government's intent for California than it is a chart for the quote unquote birth of California. The 6th and 12th house axis here is very interesting. We have Mars and Mercury in the 12th house in Libra. The communications and intent of what the US wanted from California was hidden. Venus, the glue of a society, and the moon, the people, are in the 1st house conjunct the ascendant in Scorpio. The focus appears to be on the people and the unification of these people, but with Scorpio, we're seeing hidden intent as it looks back to that Mars in the 12th house. I'm seeing themes of exploitation all over this chart. In the 6th house, we see that Uranus and Pluto are now conjunct in the 6th house in Aries. This is a 127-year cycle that resets with the government bringing in the state of California. It's very interesting when you think of all the technology and advances that the US has gained throughout history from the workers of California. That 6th house also has a retrograde Saturn in its fall in Aries. Saturn represents the landowners, the government and its institution, the repressive and controlling forces of the government. We see the government taking ownership of the innovation and skills of the workers of California and establishing a government that the state must operate under. We see the Sun and Jupiter both in the 11th house of Congress, indicating the laws of the federal government now taking precedent over California's own state laws. It's interesting to think about this now today when a Californian's vote for president of the United States is only worth 1/3 of a citizen from North Dakota's vote. When we look at the Senate, the discrepancy is even greater. A person in North Dakota has 50 times the representation in the Senate than a citizen from California. Seems exploitative to me. I also want to highlight the nodal points on this chart. Notice that the South Node is in the 4th house, indicating a loss of the land. And the North Node is in the 10th house, indicating an increase in authority or governmental rule over California and its land. The admission of California to the United States happened in the middle of the gold rush, where lots of taxes and resources were taken from the state and made available to the federal government. The nodal axis is a perfect representation of the intent of this bringing in of California as a state. Finally, let's look at the moon again. We are in a crescent moon phase with California's entry into the United States. California entering the United States was the start of a new chapter of our country's history. It was the first West Coast state to join, with Oregon joining 9 years later and Washington completing the coastline in 1889. This brings me to the chart for the current Constitution of California and what I think best represents California today. In the 1870s, California completely rewrote its constitution, and the seat of power was moved to Sacramento. The new constitution went into effect at 12 noon on July 4th, 1879, which is the date and time that this chart is cast. My immediate draw to this chart is the sun, sitting on the midheaven and trining Jupiter in the 6th house. When we think of California, we think of the sun. When the population of California boomed in the 1930s, California was considered the promised land. This chart gives us the most hope for a government for the people, signified by the sun in the 10th house being in trine with Jupiter, the planet of justice, in the 6th house of the workers. Government that favors the workers. We see this today with one of the highest minimum wages in the country, paid family leave as a state law, and greater worker safety laws. We see that the Sun-Jupiter trine forms sextiles to Neptune in the 8th house, giving more glimpses of the promised land, the land of glamour, the arts, an ideal society, and the delusions that come with that thinking. Neptune being in Taurus, California has had a very stable economy of taking other people's money in exchange for indulging in the glamour and escapism of Hollywood movies and media. Such a perfect 8th house placement. Notice its conjunction to Chiron, the state wound. The escapism of Hollywood can be both therapeutic and damaging. We see a lot of superficiality in California and an unattainable media image that is sent out to the nation through shows like The Kardashians, a group of Californian sisters that portray a level of opulence and beauty that is the pinnacle of Venusian Taurus, but completely out of reach for the majority of Americans. I'll get to that Pluto, but first I want to direct us back to the Sun in Cancer, looking to the Moon in Capricorn in the 4th house. This really brings it back to the land and the agriculture of California, which is its jewel and greatest asset. We see the people greatly connected to the land for better or for worse, as we're seeing through climate change and the massive California fires. We're seeing that people are in detriment with their connection to the land, just as the moon is in detriment in Capricorn. But this is a very rooted placement that I feel really gets at the core of the average Californian. There is a connection with the land, and there is a Capricornian security in the land. I think Pluto in the 8th house in Taurus speaks to the land and the exploitation of that land to create money for others. We see it in trine with the moon, the people, in the 4th house of the land. The taking of California's resources is a big factor in its history, being founded by the gold rush and wars to gain control of the land and their resources. Counteracting that Pluto-Moon trine, we see Pluto squaring Venus in Leo in the 11th house of the government. To me, this is the people using the state government to fight the exploitation and loss of resources to others. I see this as the birth of environmentalism in this chart. California has some of the most restrictive environmental laws in the country. And we see Uranus in the 12th house in Virgo, bringing discretion, revolution, and change to what was once hidden. Dumping pollutants into the ocean is no longer tolerated. Invisible air pollution is regulated, and the state is utilizing lands that are not populated to place alternative energy farms like solar upon them. The other piece that really makes this the chart of California for me is that it is a mere 14 hours after the full moon eclipse. The night before the current constitution was enacted, there was a full moon eclipse at 11 degrees Capricorn. This full moon eclipse supercharges the importance of the people and the land of California. The sun's light fully illuminates the people, giving them its power. This full moon foreshadowed the solar eclipse 2 weeks later on July 19th at 26 degrees Cancer, dimming the light of the 10th house. This solar eclipse was a Sanos Series 7 South eclipse. Bernadette Brady says of this eclipse cycle, the individual experiencing this series will find that huge obstacles will suddenly and easily clear, or on the negative side, a pending potential crisis will suddenly manifest and move through their life very rapidly. Either way, the individual will feel that everything is moving at a great speed. This seems to sum up California, where life moves really fast. We know California to set the trends and to move with lightning speed to the next big thing. As important as the sun is to California, I feel that this chart being cast shortly after a lunar eclipse puts that emphasis on the moon, the people, over the government or its leader. The second lunar eclipse of this series happened about a month later on August 2nd at 9 degrees Aquarius in the 5th house of this chart. This shows emotionally where California was going, which was a state built on amusement, entertainment, and pleasure. This is the California archetype that is revered and celebrated throughout the world. I traveled Europe this summer, and every European I met, when I told them where I was from, gave the same wistful sigh of reverence for the land of California. With my remaining time, I'd like to apply this chart to a predictive technique to give you an example of why I feel this chart works best for forecasting for our present day California. On the inner rim here, we've got the current Constitution of California natal chart. And then on the outer rim is a chart of the Aries ingress of 2022. Since the ascendant of this ingress chart is in a fixed sign, the chart is considered a predictive tool for the year until the Aries ingress of 2023. Had the ascendant been mutable, we would have used this chart for about 6 months. And if cardinal, we would have cast a new chart every 3 months on each cardinal ingress. Looking at this chart, what stands out to me is the ingress Pluto in the 4th house, trining natal Pluto in the 8th house. and the north nodes also trining with the ingress north node in the 8th house and the natal north node in the 4th. This is a transformational year for land management and changes made to broaden and increase land protection, requiring those who are benefiting off the land to give something back. And we're seeing that as, if you live in California, you see PG&E putting out commercials constantly about how they are burying electrical lines, which is what has started some of our wildfires, is downed electrical lines by PG&E, our power company here. And we're also seeing that the drought continues to be a worsening concern, and it's a major talk among the government and special sessions of the government. The ingress midheaven in the 4th house as well is in the 4th house as well, and that's bringing those land issues as a primary concern again this year. Another interesting thing is that the nodal axis, and therefore the eclipse that will be happening this year, are happening in the 2nd and 8th houses. Our resources and those that would take and lay claim to those resources being in the spotlight or emphasis with the eclipses. With the ingress moon in Libra in the 1st house, the people are at the forefront reconsidering what it means to be Californian and how do we rebalance our society. Ingress Venus, Saturn, and Mars are all in the 5th house of children and childbirth, family planning. The talk of abortion rights and women's rights are at the forefront of the public right now. When this chart was cast for March, we had no clue that Roe v. Wade would be overturned, but we can see it foreshadowed as a level of concern for the women of people of California. Ingress Jupiter, Mercury, and Neptune are in the house of workers. Workers want a more ideal working environment. There are pushes to expand workers' protections and rights. Much of the state workers have had their jobs become permanently remote, and the quality of workers' lives are at the forefront this year. Every Aries ingress will have that Aries in the 7th house for this California chart, but it shows how the governor is a major figure and gaining notoriety on the national scale. The 7th house being foreign affairs or relations with other groups. We're seeing Governor Newsom come out more nationally, airing ads in Florida, really kind of pushing California politics across the country. Finally, the ingress Uranus is conjunct Neptune Chiron, indicating a transformation of Hollywood glamour. We're starting to see some pushback on their unrealistic images that come from the media, and a more diverse group of people are being portrayed in movies and on television, and they're being rewarded for their efforts at Hollywood award ceremonies like the Emmys. I want to take a very quick look at the same Aries ingress chart against the emission chart as an example of how I see this as more of a federal government's outlook on California and more the story of California's role as part of the greater United States. Notice that the ingress moon here is in the 12th house. The people are hidden, the silence of the people of California, our lack of representation. We see this so clearly in the direction of the federal Supreme Court being opposite the California courts and ideals. As I mentioned when we were looking at this emission chart, the diminished voice of a California citizen compared to citizens of other states. Looking at the 4th house, we see ingress Mars, Venus, and Saturn there on this chart. The Supreme Court and the law keeping a rein on the land, trying to repress women's reproductive rights. Ingress Venus sitting conjunct on that natal south node of extraction, the losing of rights. Let's hope that the ingress Pluto and the midheaven in the 3rd house leads to a metamorphosis in communication from the federal level to California. And we see the ingress Sun in the 6th house as President Biden, working to appeal to the workers, embraces more Californian social principles. Overall, this seems very federal level concerns compared to what we saw with the current Constitution of California being more about state concerns. Before I wrap up, I wanted to also promote our new KeplerCollege Astrologers Toastmasters Club, which Meghna, who will be coming up next, and I are both members of, along with some of our faculty, including Donna. And we're an online club that meets Wednesdays at 11:30 Pacific. We have all levels of astrologers in the club, and the themes of each meeting are of an astrological topic. It's a great opportunity to improve your public speaking skills as well as learn from other astrologers all around the world. We would love to have anyone interested join us for a meeting to see if it's a fit for you. I'm currently serving as the Vice President of Public Relations for the club, and you can email me at the email address here on the screen, and I'll post it in the chat when I'm done. We would just love to hear from you and have you join us. And I'll give you a quick view of my sources for today's talk. And then here's my information. I so appreciate you attending the showcase, and I appreciate your support. Feel free if you want to reach out to me about any of this.